Okay. Well, hello, this is Darren Guccione. Hello, everyone. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Keeper Security. I just wanted to thank everyone in advance for participating today. And we're going to talk about 5 critical cybersecurity strategies as we've all migrated to global remote work environments. So just in terms of the agenda today, I'm going to cover these 5 items, and we can get into some Q&A at the end. But the first thing I want to talk about is just the remote work cybersecurity challenges as we've all migrated into different architectures. The next is the COVID-19 cyber threat landscape and what we're seeing out there in terms of the increase in attack vectors and the types of threats that we're seeing out there in terms of the most common. And then 5 critical cybersecurity strategies that I think can help every business, regardless of its size or industry. We'll talk about some tips and takeaways thereafter, and then we can get into Q&A. So just starting off, as we talk about what has happened over the past 2 months, there's been a radical and global shift from on-prem to remote. And there are companies that have done this on a hybrid basis, but I can tell you that even our company, for example, that was really set up for a cloud architecture to begin with, migrated in about a day and a half in terms of just from zero to, just to completion. And I will tell you that the larger the company and the more seated they are on-prem, this has been somewhat of a very challenging issue as it relates to every single department of a company and how they operate, both from a productivity perspective, efficiency, and then, of course, in terms of cybersecurity protection. We have seen, as a result, a much larger number of cyber attacks, especially around phishing and ransomware, and of course, password-based attacks, really sourced from the dark web, and we'll get into that in a little bit. General lack of IT resources and guidance, just because this pandemic and now the global crisis hit so fast and hard that a lot of companies didn't have much time to react. Number 3, we've seen a heavy dependence on unsecured third-party applications. Third-party productivity applications and even security applications have become very, very important. We have to take a critical view of them, which is really different and more astute than ever before. And number 4, we've seen an increased use of personal devices for business purposes. So in terms of BYOD, we now see this transacting at a much higher volume throughout the entire day. So the challenge here is that businesses are now trying to figure out, how do I govern information and devices in terms of the information, especially when the company doesn't own the device? How do we control what data is being transacted? The second thing that we talk about and look at is, well, what about networks in our homes? The networks in our homes are being used to connect to these devices. We're remoting into work. What do we do? So we'll get into that too. So let's talk about the COVID-19 cyber threat landscape. 80% of all threats this year so far have leveraged the virus as a theme in their attacks. In other words, when there is a mass amount of movement or migration to remote work environments and a greater number of endpoints, right? A greater level of anxiety. This is as much about the physical and the psychological as it is about just general architecture. It involves everything. There's a state of panic. There's a state of uncertainty. There's transitioning. There's so much going on that cyber criminals really gravitate towards situations like this because they always want to attack the lowest hanging fruit and any companies that they view as a potential weakness. 60% of breaches involved vulnerabilities for which a patch was available, but unfortunately, the patches were not applied. And we're going to get into that in a little bit too. So now if we talk about the most common threat vectors during COVID-19, here's what we are seeing. So number 1 is that there has been a 350% increase. That's 3.5x increase by virtue of this virus and this outbreak, 350%. Thousands of phishing sites that are COVID-based are being created on a daily basis, meaning these are malicious websites that are being used to lure victims that don't know any better. For example, let's assume that they're trying to solicit a charitable donation to a cause, right, to help against fighting COVID. Well, the problem that we have is that a lot of these websites are malicious and they're stealing login credentials and payment information and defrauding the public. And this is happening on a mass scale. Next is ransomware. So we see these ransomware attacks that are locking up computers for ransom. They're becoming more sophisticated and damaging, especially around healthcare. Healthcare and financial services are the top two organizations that are experiencing this type of vector. There's been an over 300% increase in ransomware attacks compared to last year. So a radical increase of 3x just really in the first quarter of this year. Next, we'll talk about COVID-19 related threats for the first quarter. So if you look at the total number of spam messages that are being used to lure victims, we have seen over 900,000, based on the data, over 900,000 unique spam messages that are being used in these attacks, especially around phishing scams. Next was unique malicious URLs. We've seen over 48,000 of those. And in terms of website breaches, just so that everyone's clear, over 30,000 websites in any ordinary workday are breached. That's 30,000 websites per day that are breached. And this number has radically increased. We've seen a 260% increase in spam activity as well. So I want to talk about these two organizations in terms of the sectors and what they mean. We have seen a radical increase in terms of the histogram and the top markets being breached. The top markets that are always breached are typically these two. Even in a healthy environment and a very strong economy where we have great stability, healthcare and financial services always pull the most in terms of value of stolen information on the dark web. Healthcare, for example, has seen a 5x increase in ransomware attacks just in terms of this segment. And financial services are projected, from a cyber attack perspective, are projected to impact 38% of the total US economy. If you look at the total impact globally, this is in the trillions of dollars. I know that's just an astronomical amount of money, but when you look at the global impact on financial services and what this can mean in terms of disruption, in terms of value, that would inure to the benefit of state-sponsored cyber terrorist and cyber criminal activities, you're talking about tens of billions and even in the trillions of dollars. So next, I want to talk about why cyber attacks are radically increasing in volume. So first, it's a result of something that's pervasive, and I mentioned it earlier, and this is due to the global mass migration, where all of us are moving to remote work environments. This has, from a general perspective on a large scale, this has been disruptive because when this happens and we all go remote, a lot of traditional internal control policies become less effective and they become dilutive when it comes to exploiting or capturing security vulnerabilities. And so now as we all move to this endpoint, this much larger endpoint landscape and geometry, we now have to figure out, well, what do we need to do to make sure that we're tracking and monitoring every endpoint, i.e. smartphone, tablet, computer, across every employee in the organization? What can we do to track that down and make sure that on the prevention side of cybersecurity, we're doing what we need to do to protect our environment? So 81% of the time when there's a cyber breach or a data breach, it's always a result of weak password security. And weak password security can take on different forms, but for the most part, it covers or encompasses an area of cybersecurity that we call identity and access management. Identity and access management is a premise that basically says the right person at the right time on the right device at the right location is accessing the right information, either on a network or a device, etc. And that's really what the premise is all about. So we want to make sure that we put really strong controls around identity and access, because within that framework, in identity and access management, you have privileged access management, you have single sign-on, which we call an identity provider software, you have two-factor authentication or multi-factor authentication, and then of course you have something called EPM, which is enterprise password management. Those are really the four main systems that are used in identity and access management. So here are the four reasons for the increased attacks. So number one, on the top left, businesses were just not ready to implement security measures for remote workforces across multiple regions, right? If you think about a company that has, 10,000 or more employees, I mean, just think about what happens even with something simple like procurement, right? What happens with database management? What happens with just general security architectures and workflows as they permeate horizontally across an organization? Next would be legacy on-premise systems and apps became ineffective for attacks on endpoints. We needed to adopt something that was more cloud-based, that allowed us to, over a vast distributed remote work environment and architecture, implement technologies that are more effective, right? From an endpoint security perspective, from an EPM perspective, and from a privileged access perspective. Next was that lack of IT support for cybersecurity, lack of education and training for employees became very apparent. So what happens is when you move to remote work, anything that was a potential weakness in your internal control system or your architecture or your cybersecurity plan becomes completely apparent. That's when it becomes abundantly clear when you have gaps, either on the functional side or on the security side. And employee training, for instance, and one example of this would be just, phishing simulation, right? Phishing simulation is one of the best tools that you can utilize in a company to prevent against a password-related data breach, because at the start of it, cyber criminals are always looking for ways to capture login credentials. One of the easiest and lowest technology methods of stealing login credentials is through a phishing attack. Number four, employees use unsecured devices and networks to conduct company business. This is a huge problem, right? So let's suppose that you have, a situation where you can't get or you can't afford to get everyone a laptop computer to work remote. Let's just assume that you're in a situation financially. One thing that you can do, for instance, is you can purchase endpoint security software, install that on their device for free, and then when they transact on that device for work purposes, you now have that endpoint secured as it relates to your company's business. And this is really important. So you don't have to necessarily use the device, but you can control the data and protect the data that's being used to transact with company business. So here are now 5 critical cybersecurity strategies for remote work environments. The first is make sure that you have a modern cybersecurity plan that covers remote work environments. And we're going to talk about the 4 elements of any great cybersecurity plan. We'll do that last. I think I want to leave the most important slide to last, so we leave you with that. But we want to make sure that endpoint security and enterprise password security software is running on all of your devices. If you recall, we said that over 80% of the time when there's a data breach, it's a result of weak password security. Well, we know that password security is the Trojan horse into your business. So at the end of the day, you could have the best antivirus protection, you could have the best PAM system running, but if you do not put a cloak of armor around your password security and your password internal controls and enforcement policies, you are in real serious trouble, because this is where the cyber criminals know exists the lowest hanging fruit. This is where it's at. So start with number 1, and we'll be off to the races. Number 2, define clear procedures for reporting and responding to security incidences. And this is so important, because if everyone's remote and there's an anomaly or an incident with somebody's email system, or somebody believes in your organization that there's been a breach, you want to make sure that they have a well-defined incident response plan so that they can identify, mitigate, and reduce the cost of the cyber attack. And most importantly, we want to make sure that every person in the organization knows what to do. If they think that there's been a breach, they want to know who to report it to, how to report it, and what to do. So making sure that you have this plan in place is of paramount importance. Number 3, make sure that you have critical applications that utilize zero knowledge, zero trust, and end-to-end encryption. Zero knowledge is the premise that only you as the user of your application has full knowledge of your master password and complete control over and domain of, in terms of ownership, your encryption key that's used to encrypt and decrypt your information. When you buy these products, you want to make sure that any encryption or decryption is done client side, meaning it is done at the client device level. It is not done at the vendor level. The vendor should never be generating those keys for you. They should never have the ability to decrypt and view your information. And this is really important. So zero knowledge is very important. The premise of zero trust is the idea around privileged access, that you want to make sure that in a very simple world, you can trust, but you must verify. You can trust, but you must verify. So at the end of the day, you should know through event logging and reporting what every single user on your system, on every device, what they're doing, what they're accessing, who they're accessing and transacting with. And you should have those internal controls, those role policies, those enforcement policies, the reporting and the logging and the auditing capability in that ecosystem to make sure that you can lock everything down, that if there is an incident, whether it's through a rogue employee or an external adverse third party or bad actor, you can lock down that device and make sure that you maintain the integrity of your organization. Next would be end-to-end encryption. It's really important for information, especially the information that's really sensitive, whether it's like PII, like personal identifiable information, or sensitive digital assets like a business plan or a financial model or a tax return or wiring instructions to a bank account. If you're transacting over any type of productivity application or security application, you want to make sure that all of that information is completely encrypted from point A to point B. And that means from one user device to and through the internet, down into that device, into their screen, from A to Z. You want to make sure that you practice full end-to-end encryption. And this is going to be, these 3 things are so critical because they're intrinsic and existential elements of any great productivity and security application. Number 4, you want to provide cybersecurity training. And this is really important because even in a cybersecurity business like ours, we live, eat, and breathe cybersecurity 24/7 here at Keeper Security, and we run this simulation every single month on our team, right? Even when we're hiring, right? This is really important. Like most companies, you know, and especially in a positive environment where there's growth, you're onboarding new team members, right? Or team members in an existing organization are shifting into different departments. You want to make sure that you run this phishing simulation and this awareness training, right? We send out web-based tests that cover cybersecurity training, cybersecurity awareness, right? Things like the dark web, credential stuffing attacks. There's a litany of different topics that we like to train our team members on, even if they really don't transact or build our software. I think it's really important, regardless of the department, that every single person in the organization who uses a computing device is trained on this type of information. Really important. So this would be phishing, password security, policy enforcement, controls, and safeguards. So this is really one of the last slides, and I think this is one of the most important. And this is often overlooked. When we talk to a lot of parties, you know, we get contacted by a lot of agencies and research firms about, you know, what could these companies have done differently. And every time when we see a breach and we analyze an entity's internal control processes and their cybersecurity strategy, we typically see one of these elements, usually more than one of these elements missing. And there's really four main facets and cornerstones of a great cybersecurity strategy. The first is prevention, then detection, then remediation, then response. I'll talk a little bit about the four. So on the prevention side, that's pretty straightforward, right? We want to make sure that we have a process in place that's layered in with technology to prevent a cyber attack. Now, when I say cyber attack, you can't stop somebody from attacking your systems, but you can mitigate the risk of getting breached. If you do this right, the attackers will realize you're hardened, you're a very secure digital asset, and they'll ultimately decide to move on. Most often, cyber criminals want low-hanging fruit. They don't want to sit there trying to bang into a system, for days and hours on end, right? This is a numbers game to them, and they traditionally like to go after the lowest hanging fruit that has weak security to begin with. So prevention. The next is detection. You want to be able to detect if there's an anomaly or a problem at one of your endpoints or one of your computers in a remote environment or even internally, right? You want to detect it within seconds. You want your system to tell you there's a problem at this particular workstation for this particular user. Once you detect it, you want to remediate. So if you determine that bad actors are inside your network, we have to have technologies and processes in place to remove them from the network. Next is response. This is part of incident response and, of course, reporting. So how do you respond to it if there's been a breach? How do you report this to your team members? How do you report this to the general public? There is state-mandated requirements, right? If certain information, such as PII, is stolen in an organization, you have now a public legal responsibility to report this. So these are the four prongs of any great cybersecurity strategy. And I just wanted to talk about now some tips and takeaways. So first, to recap, we talked about enterprise-grade password security via an enterprise password management solution. I think that it doesn't matter how large or small your organization is or what industry you're in. Great EPM is extremely important because we know, again, that more than 80% of the time, weak password security is the reason for these cyber breaches. Number two, you want to make sure that you provision endpoint security software. Number three, you want to embrace zero knowledge, zero trust, and end-to-end encryption when you're reviewing security applications. And even in many cases, if you're working with a popular productivity application, ask the questions, read the disclosures, understand what type of security protocols are in place for that productivity software. Next, really important to enforce multi-factor or two-step verification across all platforms and devices. This is a very effective way at mitigating the risk of remote data breach. Next is regularly educate your employees on cybersecurity best practices, including phishing, password security, and policies, as well as those enforcement policies. Next, utilize VPNs, virtual private networks, with two-factor authentication on every critical platform. And this is really important. We do this regularly at Keeper Security with our remote teams when they have to access either a system through a VPN. We know that it's hardened. We can log it. We can make sure they're utilizing two-factor authentication, and we can make sure that they're channeling and transacting within our security framework. Next, have a comprehensive view of privileged identities and access controls in the organization. And this again falls under that identity and access management prong with PAM, privileged access management, making sure that the right people on the right devices access the right systems from the right locations at the right time. And make sure that you're logging all of those activities so that if there is a problem, you can track it down. Always perform software updates. It is amazing how often we see, and this is very frequent, So many times we see companies that fail to perform periodic and regular software updates so that they can make sure they're running the latest security patches. And this is something that really needs to be done on a regular basis to make sure that the software continues to maintain its most modern state. Make sure your employees have a clear path to report any suspicious activity or incidents on their devices. And this is just that clear communication channel between the team members that are on their devices and who they can report to in your security and architecture group. Well, that was it. And I just wanted to thank you for attending today, and I hope this was helpful for you. So we'll see if there's any questions. I'm going to go to the questions tab. Okay. Okay, so here's what this says. Anthony has asked the question, setting normal corporate business aside, what is Keeper doing to promote secure remote workforces with special offers that may even be free for a defined period or cost-reduced solutions offering during this challenging environment? The answer is no problem. We're happy to help. We sell, obviously a cybersecurity platform that is fantastic for any size business. We are very sensitive with respect to budgets and helping companies of all sizes across every industry. So feel free to contact us, keepersecurity.com, and a member of our sales team. There's a contact form on the site there where you'll see a contact us link, and we'll contact you to help you, Anthony. No problem at all. Next, are the slides going to be emailed out after? Yes. So Naz, who leads our PR team at Keeper, she will get any of the participants a copy of these slides. But I think that was it. And thank you, everyone, for attending. Appreciate it. All right, I think we'll wrap up now. Thank you.